The last transmission came in at 14:23, static first, then a voice. Young, too young. The kind of voice that still cracks when it gets cold or scared, or both at the same time. Contact East Ridge, contact East Ridge. We are, and then nothing. Just white noise over a dead frequency, and somewhere inside that silence, 540 men waiting to find out if today was the day their luck finally ran out. This is the story of the pilot who heard that silence and refused to let it stand. Her name was Captain Sarah Mercer, 27 years old, 5 feet 2 inches, 122 pounds. She flew an A-10 Thunderbolt II, which the men who loved it and the enemies who feared it called the Warthog, an ugly airplane by any honest measure. Thick, stubborn, built around a cannon the size of a small car designed to fly low and slow and absorb punishment that would shred anything more elegant. A working aircraft, a serious aircraft. The kind of machine that doesn't care about your feelings or your rank or your assumptions about who belongs in the cockpit. Sarah Mercer belonged in that cockpit the way a key belongs in a lock. What the men around her believed, and most of them believed it completely without question, the way you believe in gravity or the reliability of a sunrise, was something else entirely. But we'll get to that. First, understand what was at stake on that afternoon in the desert scrublands of Fort Creston, Nevada, when the radios went wrong and the maps stopped making sense, and 540 Marines discovered that the valley they had been sent into was not lightly defended at all. It was a trap, a good one, the kind that gets built over weeks, not hours, the kind with overlapping fields of fire and pre-sighted positions and gunners who had been waiting in the heat for days, patient as stones, for exactly this convoy to roll down exactly this road. 540 men walked into it. Not one of them died. That outcome, that specific miracle zero left behind, does not appear in the official after-action report with any explanation that holds up under scrutiny. The report credits coordinated air support and disciplined ground movement. It credits communication and leadership. It credits the courage of the Marines themselves, which is real and true, and also incomplete. What it does not mention, not by name, not by call sign, is the pilot who was never authorized to be airborne that day. The pilot who had been assigned to monitor radio traffic and log supply movements. The pilot who stood in a back corner of the command center while her superiors debated protocol and watched 540 men run out of time. Sarah Mercer flew that day because no one else was going to. And the reason no one else was going to is a story that begins not in Nevada and not in the Ironhold Basin, but in a flat stretch of Arizona farmland where the evening smelled of red dust and creosote, and a man with a limp and a fading Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm stood behind his daughter in the blue last light of day and said the 6 words she would carry for the rest of her life. Steady breath. Let the shot surprise you. His name was Earl Mercer. Sergeant First Class United States Marine Corps, retired under medical discharge in 2009 after a piece of mortar shrapnel worked its way close enough to his femoral artery that the surgeons in Landstuhl decided they would rather not test their luck trying to remove it. He came home to Red Cliff, Arizona, carrying that piece of metal and seated him like a souvenir he never asked for. He bought a small parcel of land east of town where the soil was too hard for most crops, but the light at sunset turned everything amber and clean. He put up a fence. He fixed things that needed fixing. He did not talk much about what he had seen. What he did when Sarah was old enough to hold a rifle steady was teach her to shoot, not to kill, not to win, to be accurate, to be patient, to understand that the space between deciding to fire and pulling the trigger is the most important space in the world, and that filling it with haste or ego or fear is how you miss. She was 12 the first time she lined up a row of tin cans on the fence post and knocked all 5 down without pausing between shots. Earl stood behind her with his arms crossed and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said again. By the time she was 15, she was driving out to the range with her geometry homework folded in her back pocket, shooting until her shoulder ached, then sitting on the hood of the truck to do her problems in the last light before dark. She understood angles the way other kids understood video games, instinctively, physically, like something that lived in her hands rather than her head. Earl watched all of it. He didn't praise her often, but in the evenings when they drove home with the windows down and the dust coming in and the radio playing something old, he would sometimes put his hand briefly on her shoulder without a word, and that meant more than anything he could have said. He died in the spring of 2013 when Sarah was 16. The shrapnel had migrated. The surgeons in Tucson were not as cautious as the ones in Landstuhl had been, and the operation to remove it did not go the way anyone hoped. She was in the waiting room when it happened. She was doing homework. Earl's sister Gloria had driven 4 hours from Redcliffe to be there, and it was Gloria who put her hand on Sarah's arm when the doctor came through the door, and it was in Gloria's house that Sarah spent the last 2 years before she turned 18 and enlisted, sleeping in a room with a view of the same flat horizon her father had looked at his whole life. Gloria never said much about Earl directly. She didn't need to. She kept his photograph on the shelf above the kitchen sink, and she let Sarah be whatever Sarah needed to be in the mornings before school, which was usually quiet, which was usually alone with a notebook, which was usually fine. Sarah kept the dog tag. She kept it in a small box on her dresser through those 2 years in Gloria's house, through college, through the 18 months of aviation training that nearly broke her 3 separate times before she earned the Warthog slot that fewer than 8% of applicants ever received. She kept it because it was the most honest thing. She owned a rectangle of stamped metal with a man's name and blood type on it, no more and no less than what it said it was. She wore it on every flight. There was something else Gloria had given her, though she never framed it that way. In the 2 years after Earl died, when Sarah was the quiet girl sitting at the kitchen table doing trigonometry while other kids her age were at football games, Gloria never once asked her why, never suggested she should be somewhere else, doing something more appropriate to her age, letting herself grieve in the socially recognized way. Gloria understood, without being told, that the notebook and the numbers were the grief, that working the problem was how Earl's daughter processed the world, and that this was not a deficiency. It was an inheritance. When Sarah enlisted, Gloria drove her to the recruitment office. She did not cry. She stood on the sidewalk afterward and said, "Your father always said the best thing about the Corps was that it rewarded people who prepared." Then she drove home. Sarah thought about that sentence a great deal during the years that followed. She thought about it in flight school when the instructors ran them through emergency procedures until the responses were involuntary, until your hands corrected the aircraft before your brain had finished identifying the problem. She thought about it when she got the Warthog slot and stood alone in a hallway outside the assignment office, holding the paper, and understood in a way she could not have explained to anyone that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of the preparation that mattered. Fort Creston sat at the edge of the Nevada desert like something the landscape had reluctantly agreed to tolerate. Beige buildings, tan vehicles, the kind of dust that gets into your sinuses and stays there. Heat that pressed down in the afternoon like a firm hand on the back of your neck. Sarah had been stationed there for 11 months when the orders came down for Ironhold Basin. By that point, she had learned the geography of the base the way you learn a place where you are not entirely welcome, precisely and quietly noting every exit, every corner, every room where she would and would not be acknowledged when she walked in. She was not universally disliked. That would be too simple. What she encountered was something more ambient than hostility and more corrosive than indifference. She was managed, tolerated, worked around, and assigned to the tasks that needed doing but didn't need her specifically: logistics, coordination, equipment, tracking, communications checks that any competent E4 could have handled in their sleep. Sergeant First Class Greg Holt had been the loudest voice in establishing this arrangement, though he hadn't been the only one. Holt was 35 with 3 deployments worth of hard-won authority he wore like armor. He was not a stupid man. He was in the way that competent men sometimes are, exactly wrong in a direction he would never think to examine. She heard what he said about her. You were always going to hear in a place like that. The walls were thin and voices carried, and no one lowered theirs particularly hard when the subject was someone they had already decided didn't matter. Quota bird, paper pilot, check the box. She's fine for sim work, keep her on support. Sarah Mercer's response to all of it was the same. She did not argue. She did not confront. She did not take the conversations she overheard and carry them to anyone with authority to remedy the situation, because she had already understood with the same geometric clarity that she applied to everything else, that the remedy was not going to come from above. What she did instead was work. Every evening when the chow hall noise died down and the smoke pit crowd settled in for the long ritual of complaining about everything that could safely be complained about, Sarah spread sectional charts across her bunk under a red lens flashlight. She memorized terrain. Not just the valley they were currently assigned, all of it. Every ridgeline within operational range. Every canyon cut. Every approach that looked straightforward on a flat map and became a trap in 3 dimensions. She tracked wind patterns. She noted how thermals shifted in the late afternoon over certain ridge configurations. She ran simulated gun runs in the simulator until the inputs were mechanical, until she could make the calculations without consciously making them, until her hands knew the answers before her mind had finished asking the questions. And she kept the kneeboard. It was a small thing, green cover slightly faded. The kind of kneeboard that gets issued and then replaced with something more official once you move up the ranks. She had never replaced it. It was full of her own shorthand Canon harmonics at various speeds and temperatures, pylon load data, and recoil compensation, fuel burn projections, worked out by hand for contingencies that official planning never accounted for. Pages and pages of small, neat numbers, arrows crossing grids, tables cross-referencing conditions she had observed with outcomes she had recorded. Private doctrine, all of it, invisible to the people who had already decided she had none. The kneeboard had started as a supplement to the official materials. It had become something else. It had become the primary record of everything she knew that the institution did not know. She knew the gap between what her training had given her and what her own attention had accumulated in the hours and evenings no one supervised. She wrote in it the way some people pray. Not for audience, not for record, because the act of writing made the knowledge more real, more owned, more certain to be there when she reached for it. She brought it to the flight line every morning and wrote in it between maintenance checks. She brought it to briefings and balanced it on her knee in the back row. She brought it everywhere the way some people carry phones, not from anxiety, but from habit, from the comfort of having the numbers close. On the morning that would eventually change everything, she was sitting on a folded tarp at the edge of the flight line, kneeboard open, working through corrections for high-temperature cannon operation, when Holt walked past with two other NCCOs. He didn't stop. He barely slowed. "Quota bird doing homework again," he said, not to her, to the air beside him, and the two men with him produced the obligatory sounds of amusement, and they kept walking. Sarah finished the number she was writing, circled it, moved on to the next one. It was 2 days before the Ironhold operation that she found the file. She had been assigned to audit equipment manifest, a task so administrative that most people would have done it in 20 minutes without reading anything carefully. Sarah read carefully. She always did. It was a habit that had never once been disadvantageous. The equipment logs cross-referenced against personnel rosters. The personnel rosters cross-referenced against mission assignments. And in the mission assignment records going back 6 months, she found something that stopped her hand mid-page. June 14th, 2023. Close air support rotation forward deployment. Assigned flight assets, 3 pilots listed by priority. Position 1 was her name, Captain Sarah Mercer. Her qualification scores had put her there, the highest CAS ratings in her cohort, which was a fact that existed in the system without ever seeming to produce any real-world effect. The name had been crossed out, manually. A line through it in the digital record, the kind of administrative deletion that looks routine until you look at who made it. Colonel Raymond Voss. No explanation attached, no substitution notes, just the deletion and the date and the signature. She sat with it for a long moment. The air conditioning hummed. Somewhere outside, a vehicle started up and drove away. Then Sarah Mercer folded the screen down, picked up her kneeboard, opened it to the next blank page, and wrote the date, the document reference number, and 3 words: confirm, preserve, wait. She did not go to anyone. She put it away and went back to the equipment. Manifest, which she finished with the same thoroughness she had started with, logged it correctly, and submitted it on time. She held the knowledge like a stone in her hand. Heavy, real, the shape of a thing that would matter later. Colonel Raymond Voss was 54 years old and had been in the United States Army for 31 of them. He carried himself the way men do after 3 decades inside a hierarchy, the way he occupied space, the way he moved through rooms, the way other people adjusted their positions when he entered. Not swagger exactly, something more settled than swagger. The authority of a man who had been right often enough in places that counted to have earned the confidence he projected. He had also been wrong, once in a way that mattered. In the fall of 2019, at a forward operating base that you will not find easily on any public map, Voss had made a call that deviated from established protocol. The situation had seemed to warrant it. The intelligence had seemed reliable. The window had seemed to be closing. 3 men were wounded in the operation that followed. 1 never came back to full duty. The investigation cleared Voss of misconduct. The situation genuinely was ambiguous, but the clearing didn't change what he knew privately in the interior space where men of his type kept their reckonings. He had gone outside the lines. 3 men paid for it. He had never spoken about the 2019 operation to anyone at Fort Creston. He did not need to. It lived in him the way certain things live in the people they have marked, not as memory exactly, more as a permanent alteration of threshold. a recalibration of how much he needed to be certain before he acted. The problem was that the recalibration had been set too high. He had moved from a man who trusted his judgment too readily to a man who no longer trusted it at all, and he had told himself this was wisdom, and for 5 years no one had given him sufficient reason to know it wasn't. Sarah Mercer, in the way she occupied the base quietly, competently, persistently, was not the kind of challenge he recognized as a challenge. She was not demanding anything. She was not agitating or complaining or building alliances. She was simply present, doing her work, attending briefings, keeping her kneeboard. And because she was not making any noise, it was easy to decide the absence of noise meant the absence of anything worth hearing. From that point forward, protocol was not a set of guidelines for Voss. It was a wall, a load-bearing wall, the kind you do not remove without bringing down the structure. He understood that flexibility was sometimes the difference between success and failure. He held his position anyway because the alternative, becoming a man who trusted his own judgment again, who let himself believe that this situation was different, was not a risk he was willing to take. He was not an unkind man. He was not a bigoted man exactly in any way he would have recognized as such. What he was with respect to Sarah Mercer was a man who had made a decision about the kind of experience in history you needed before you had earned the right to break rules he no longer broke himself. She was 27. She had come up through training, not through combat. Her qualification scores were excellent, but scores were controlled environments, and controlled environments had limits. She was fine for support work. That was what he believed. He believed it the way people believe things that are convenient to believe, not because they have examined the evidence and found it wanting, but because they have not examined the evidence at all. He would think about this later. He would have a great deal of time to think about it. The briefing for Ironhold Basin was held on a Thursday morning in the main operations room. 43 people in a space built for 30. The air conditioning was struggling. Voss stood at the front with a laser pointer and the economy of a man who had run 1,000 briefings. The map on the screen showed Ironhold Basin roughly 6 kilometers long, 2 wide at its widest point, a dried river valley with ridgelines on 3 sides and a single primary access route running in from the northwest. Intel assessment had characterized the area as lightly defended. Enemy presence estimated at a small mobile force. Standard sweep and clear. Move in, confirm, establish, control, consolidate. 48 hours. Sarah was in the back row. She had been in the back row since the first week. She had been looking at that map for 3 days. Not the version Voss was pointing at now, which was a tactical overlay focused on grid coordinates. The topographic version. The one that showed elevation and contour. The one that told you what the terrain actually was rather than what it looked like from the air at 500 feet. The ridgeline on the eastern edge dropped steeply toward a narrow spur formation that projected into the valley floor, an ideal elevated firing position with a clear sweep across the primary road. The draw at the southern end was wide enough to conceal a substantial force. The valley itself, when you looked at the access road and the surrounding high ground together, formed something that fire control doctrine would recognize immediately. Overlapping fields, kill zones at each transition point, natural cover on 3 sides. She raised her hand. Sir. She kept her voice level, informational, the same tone she used when she found an error in an equipment log. She pointed to the projected image. Have we considered that this terrain configuration is consistent with a prepared ambush? These elevations on the eastern spur give overlapping fire coverage across the entire access corridor. A positioned force here could control the valley floor completely. Voss looked at her for a moment. Captain, he said, you track equipment, not terrain. A sound moved through the room, not laughter exactly, the sound that precedes laughter when people are waiting to see if it is appropriate. She put her hand down. She closed the kneeboard which she had opened to her topographic notes. The briefing continued. Movement orders, logistics, timeline. When it ended, she walked out through the crowd and went back to her workspace and sat down. She pulled out the kneeboard and opened it to a clean page. She wrote the date, the time, the name of the valley, and then she wrote source credibility. Below that, she wrote a document reference number. She had memorized the identifier for the intelligence assessment that had characterized Ironhold as lightly defended. She had seen that number before. It had taken her the better part of an evening to confirm it, cross-referencing assessment logs against source reliability records. The identifier belonging to a human intelligence source used in 3 previous assessments over the past 18 months. Of those 3, 2 had proven significantly inaccurate in ways that had operational consequences. She had filed a source reliability concern in August of 2023. She had flagged the identifier. She had written in the precise language of such reports recommend additional corroboration before operationalizing this source's assessments. The report was in the system. Filed correctly, timestamped accurately. She had never received a response. Below the source identifier, she wrote 4 words, "if burned, kill box." She underlined it once. Then she put the kneeboard away and went back to work. The convoy would roll in the morning, 540 men, moving by doctrine on schedule down a road that led straight into the narrowest part of a valley she had traced with her own hands 3 nights in a row. She sat at her desk for a long time after the log was finished. The base settled into its evening rhythms around her. Someone was laughing 2 rooms over. A vehicle idled outside and then drove away. She opened the kneeboard to the page with the topographic notes. She studied the numbers, the distances, the elevation changes, the canon harmonics for a low-slow pass at various approach angles, the wind correction factors for late afternoon when thermals off the ridgeline would push right to left. She had run the geometry many times. She had run it in the simulator on off hours logged under maintenance verification protocols that no one was monitoring closely. She had run it until it was automatic, until her hands knew the numbers and her hands knew what to do with them. She closed the kneeboard. She set it beside her father's dog tag, which she had taken off its chain and placed on the desk while she worked the way she sometimes did when she needed to think clearly. She looked at both of them for a moment. Then she put the dog tag back on, clipped the kneeboard to her flight vest, and went to bed. Tomorrow the convoy would move. Tomorrow the radios would tick with routine traffic position checks and fuel tallies, the ordinary sounds of a large formation moving through terrain it expected to own. And then at 14:23, a 19-year-old named Owen Price would key his radio for the last time before everything came apart, and his voice would carry across the frequency, thin and frightened, and reaching for anyone who might be listening. "Contact East Ridge. Contact East Ridge." We or Sarah Mercer would be in the support room when it happened, assigned to logistics, assigned to stay in her lane. She had been patient for a very long time. She had the geometry. She had the numbers. She had the kneeboard and the years of quiet work inside it, and the muscle memory of 1,000 hours no one had ever watched or credited or thought about at all. She had her father's dog tag and his 6 words in the stillness that comes from having made a decision before the decision is required, so that when the moment arrives, there is no hesitation, only motion. The base went dark. The desert went quiet. Somewhere beyond the wire, 540 men settled in for a night's sleep before the morning they expected. Sarah Mercer lay on her bunk with one hand on the kneeboard and did not sleep at all. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. Not the silence of a radio that has been turned off or a frequency that has been changed. The silence of a radio that was live a moment ago carrying a voice and is now carrying nothing. The kind of silence that has a shape to it. The kind that lands in a room like a physical object and changes the temperature of the air. Sarah heard it from the support room. She was at her station headset on, running through the logistics checklist she had been assigned. Supply convoy ETA. Fuel status at forward positions. Ammunition inventories for the outlying elements. Work that required enough attention to occupy the hands and not nearly enough to occupy the mind. She had been doing it for 4 hours. She had been doing it well because she did everything well, because that was the only mode she knew. The tactical net was running in the background the way it always ran, the steady low rhythm of position checks and status updates, the ordinary pulse of a large formation, doing what large formations do in the early hours of a planned operation. Grid coordinates confirmed. Movement to phase line Bravo on schedule. Weather holding. Road surface firm after the previous night's temperature drop. Routine. All of it routine. At 14:19, the rhythm changed, not dramatically at first. One transmission that came in clipped a word cut off at the end. Then a pause that ran 4 seconds longer than it should have. Then 2 voices on the net at the same time, which did not happen when things were going correctly. Sarah stopped writing. She pulled the logistics checklist aside. She reached up and adjusted the headset, clearing the seal against her left ear, the way she did when she needed to hear precisely and completely. At 14:21, a squad leader's voice came across the net with the trained flatness of a man working very hard to keep his tone professional. Possible contact East Ridge line. Investigating. Possible. Not confirmed. The word possible doing a great deal of work. The word possible being used by a man who already knew what he was looking at, but wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Sarah was already on her feet. She crossed to the doorway connecting the support room to the main command center. She stopped there. She did not go in. She stood where she could see the screens without being in the room in any official capacity. Colonel Voss was at the center console. Major Clifton, his operations officer, was to his left. The room smelled of burned coffee and recycled air. At 14:23, Private First Class Owen Price keyed his radio. His voice was 19 years old, and it was the first time he had ever been shot at, and both of those things were audible in every syllable. Contact East Ridge. Contact East Ridge. The frequency died. The room went still. Not the still of people who do not know what to do. The still of people who know exactly what to do and are trying to find a version of events in which they do not have to do it yet. Voss said, "Get me confirmation." The radio operator tried. The frequency gave back static and silence, and then a different voice, not Price Older, a staff sergeant who had been in long enough to have the fear somewhere underneath the professionalism, where it was still useful but not disabling. Taking fire East Ridge. Taking fire East Ridge. Multiple positions. We need, then static again. On the drone feed, the convoy's formation, which had been a clean progression of vehicles moving along the valley floor in proper spacing, was compressed. The vehicles had stopped. Some had moved off the road. On the thermal overlay, the ridgelines on the eastern and southern edges of the valley were beginning to light with small white blooms that the system rendered for weapons discharge. Not one position, not two. Multiple. Distributed. Pre-sighted. Sarah was looking at the drone feed from the doorway, and she was counting the bloom points, and she was doing the geometry, and the geometry was confirming what she had written in the kneeboard 2 nights before. Eastern spur, overlapping coverage of the road. Southern draw RPG positions. Western approach cut off by the valley's natural narrowing at the far end. They were in a bowl. A prepared bowl. She had said so. In a room full of people. She had been told to track equipment. She watched Major Clifton pull out the protocol binder. She watched him find the relevant section with the practiced efficiency of a man who has reached for the same binder many times. She watched him read from it not because he didn't know what it said, but because reading it aloud made it official. No close air support within 200 meters of friendly positions without direct authorization from the ground force commander, who was currently pinned inside the valley with no ability to communicate anything. No artillery clearance available. The angles were wrong, the guns positioned for the expected operation, not for this one. No quick reaction force within effective range. Hold position, wait for the situation to develop. Follow protocol. Voss repeated the key phrase 200-meter rule stands. The words had the quality of a wall being constructed in real time. Sarah watched it happen. She watched the wall go up, and she watched the men in the room find it reassuring. In the way that walls are reassuring when you are standing on the inside of them, when you can tell yourself that the wall exists for good reasons, and the good reasons still apply. The trouble with walls is that the people inside them and the people outside them experience the same structure differently. Outside that wall on the valley floor, things were not waiting for the protocol to be resolved. She stepped into the command center. No one acknowledged her. She was support staff. She found a position near the back wall, and she stood there, and she did not stop counting. More voices on the net, some controlled, some not. A lieutenant calling for smoke being told the wind was wrong, the smoke would blow back across their own position. An NCO trying to organize a movement to better cover being told there was no better cover in any direction that wasn't worse in some other direction. On the drone feed, one of the vehicles on the road was burning. The thermal bloom of it dominated the lower right quadrant of the screen. Price's voice came back on the net, intermittent, breaking up. He was describing his position. He was describing the direction of fire. He was 19 years old and had been in the valley for 3 hours and was now trying to relay accurate tactical information while staying low enough to avoid being shot. And Sarah could hear in the rhythm of his breathing, even through the static, how hard he was working to keep himself together. She looked at Voss. He was watching the screen, his jaw set in the way of a man holding a position. He has decided to hold a position that was not tactical, but procedural, and the procedure had been written for situations that were not this one. She said, "Sir." The word landed in a gap between radio transmissions. Several people looked at her. Voss looked at her. She said, "I can put a cannon pass on that eastern spur without coming within 200 meters of any friendly position. The geometry works. The spur is elevated and separated. Give me a launch window and I can break the eastern anchor." Major Clifton said there is no authorized air asset for this operation. She said the Warthog on Pad 3 is fueled and armed from this morning's maintenance rotation. It hasn't been stood down. Voss said the 200-meter rule stands, Captain. She said, "Sir, the rule was written to prevent fratricide on flat terrain. The spur is 40 meters above the valley floor and 300 meters from the nearest friendly position at its closest point. The geometry is different." Holt was at the door. He said with the casual authority of a man who has never questioned whether his authority was appropriate, "Stay in your lane." The radio brought Price's voice again. "Thinner now. Multiple casualties. We cannot push forward. We cannot withdraw. We are requesting any available fire support. Requesting any available static." Then something changed. One of the junior intelligence officers assigned to the command center, a young captain named Delaney, who had been standing at a secondary console, visible but peripheral, in the way junior officers learn to be peripheral, in rooms run by senior ones, stepped towards Sarah, not toward Voss, towards Sarah. He said it quietly, almost under the radio noise, but she heard every word. "The route was compromised before they left. I've been trying to write it up for 2 days and I can't get it in front of anyone who'll act on it. The source identifier for the Ironhold intel, someone fed that route through the same channel. This wasn't a coincidence. They were waiting." Sarah looked at him. He was pale. He had the look of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for a room that doesn't want to receive it. She said, "How long have you known?" He said, "Long enough that if you're going to do something, you need to do it now." She turned back to the drone feed, the eastern spur gun position, the machine gun traversing in its steady, patient arc across the valley floor. The Marines below it with nowhere to go. She looked at Voss one more time. He was watching the screen, his hands folded in front of him. A man keeping a promise he had made to himself in 2019, and the promise was killing people. She said quietly, "I can end this." No one answered her. She turned and walked out. She did not go back to the support room. She went left out of the door and through the side exit and across the apron toward the flight line, and the Nevada afternoon hit her like a flat hand, heat and glare, and the smell of aviation fuel and hot concrete. Her footsteps were even. She was not running. Running draws attention. She wanted pad 3. She had her flight vest on. She always wore it during operational periods because that was correct. The kneeboard was clipped to the left side. She could feel its weight with every stride. She thought walking about the 11 months that had led to this moment. Not romantically. Not with any sense of culmination. She thought about it the way an engineer thinks about a load calculation. Here are the inputs. Here are the conditions. Here is what the structure is being asked to bear. She had spent 11 months building something. The building had not been dramatic. It had been quiet and repetitive and largely invisible. Evening after evening with the flashlight and the charts. Run after run in the simulator. Page after page in the kneeboard. She had not known exactly when it would be needed. She had known that it would be. That was enough. That had always been enough. She reached pad 3. The Warthog sat in the afternoon heat, tethered and silent, thick fuselage, twin engines, high and rearward the barrel of the GAU-8 cannon protruding from the nose with the blunt confidence of something that has no interest in being metaphorical. She began her walk-around. The walk-around was never optional. You did not skip it because you were in a hurry. You did it because it was the difference between knowing what you had and assuming it, and she had learned from a man who limped across Arizona farmland that assuming things was how you missed. Left main gear. Fuselage inspection, left engine nacelle, left wing pylon. She paused. The indicator light on the left pylon sensor housing was amber. She stopped. She leaned in. The amber light meant the thermal regulation circuit for the weapons targeting compensation was reporting a fault. In normal operations, this fault would ground the aircraft until the circuit was inspected and cleared. She pulled out her kneeboard. She opened it to the section on cannon harmonics and pylon configuration. The data was there in her own handwriting. What the pylon fault meant in practical terms was that the GAU-8's automatic ballistic compensation, the system that adjusted for barrel heat expansion, atmospheric pressure variations, and flight attitude, was not going to function. She was going to have to calculate the corrections herself in real time, in the air. While flying low and slow over terrain that would be actively trying to kill her, no other pilot on the base could do this without avionics support. She knew that not from arrogance, but from the simple arithmetic of who had sat alone under a red lens flashlight building these tables for 11 months. She stood on the pad for a moment. The heat came off the concrete in visible waves. She did not feel afraid. What she felt was something closer to recognition, the sensation of arriving at a place you have been moving toward for a long time without knowing the exact address. The pylon fault was the final confirmation. The kneeboard was not a hobby. It was not compulsive record keeping. It was preparation for this. For the moment when the systems that were supposed to work didn't, and the only thing left was the knowledge she had built herself. She thought about Owen Price, 19 years old, his voice reaching through the static, maintaining accuracy and sequence, even as the control quality came apart. She thought about what it meant to be 19 years old in that valley, with the exits closing and no answer coming from the frequency you were broadcasting on. She reached up to her collar and unclipped the dog tag chain. She held it in her hand for a moment, the metal warm from her skin. Earl Mercer, Sergeant First Class, blood type O positive. She climbed into the cockpit. The canopy seal engaged with its familiar pressure. The cockpit wrapped around her the way it always did, not cramped, but fitted. Purposeful. A space designed for doing things that needed to be done, and she was the thing it had been designed for. She set the dog tag on the upper left corner of the instrument panel below the HUD, where she could see it without looking away from the instruments. She began the startup sequence. Right engine first. The turbine came up with the rising whine becoming a steady roar, instruments coming alive across the panel. Left engine, systems check. Navigation, weapons, cannon readiness green. Pylon left amber warning as expected. She opened the kneeboard on her thigh and read through the correction tables one more time. She committed the critical values to the short-term memory that flight demanded, not referenced from a page, but held owned available, the way a musician owns a piece of music they have played until it is no longer notation but motion. The difference between knowing a number and being that number. She had reached that threshold months ago. She was simply confirming it. She called Tower. Tower cleared her for the pod without concern. Aircraft moved on and off the pads for legitimate reasons, and no one had yet had the presence of mind to put out a hold order on this specific aircraft. She had approximately 90 seconds before someone in the command center heard the engine spool and made the connection. She used the 90 seconds finishing her pre-taxi check. By the time anyone in the command center realized what was happening, she was rolling. The Ironhold Basin appeared below her 11 minutes after takeoff. She had flown the approach, low hugging the terrain on the northern edge, using the ridgeline as cover the way she had practiced until the profile was part of her body. Low and slow and tight to the rock, the Warthog absorbing the altitude and turbulence with the unperturbed solidity of something designed for exactly this. When she cleared the northern ridgeline and the valley opened below her, the sight of it landed in her chest like a stone. She had drawn this valley. She had traced its contour lines under a flashlight in the dark. She had calculated distances and elevations and firing angles from memory and from notes. None of that had prepared her for seeing it like this. The convoy was stopped across the valley floor in the compressed formation of vehicles that have nowhere to go. Two were burning. The smoke rose in thick columns that the afternoon wind pushed south. On the eastern spur, the gun position she had been tracking was elevated pre-sandbag crew still active, traversing for another run down the road. On the valley floor between the vehicles and the ridgeline, figures were moving. Small at this altitude. Moving the way people move when movement is dangerous, low and quick and unpredictable. Some of them were not moving. She leveled her orbit. She built a targeting solution while she confirmed what she was looking at. She pulled the kneeboard from her thigh and read the corrections one more time. No auto-compensation. She was working with thermal expansion data for the barrel temperature range she estimated from the morning's test fire. Pressure altitude corrections calculated during the flight. Wind data read in real time from the smoke column behavior below her and the thermal drift she could feel in the airframe. She was working. The radio was loud now, multiple voices, some ordered and some not. She heard Price's voice once in the mix, brief and broken, and something in her chest tightened and then went still. She lined up the approach to the eastern spur. The spur was 340 meters from the nearest friendly position, 42 meters above the valley floor. She was going to need to come in from the north at a shallow angle that kept the gun run on the spur and round dispersion away from the valley floor entirely. It was not an easy shot. It was exactly the kind of shot that required the specific knowledge she had written down in a small green kneeboard that no one had ever read. Her hand was steady. She thought about her father standing behind her in the last light of an Arizona evening. She thought about his hand on her shoulder on the drives home, the whole of his approval contained in that single wordless gesture. Steady breath. She lined up the reticle. Let the shot surprise you. She pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 spoke. The sound of it was not an explosion. It was something lower and more continuous, a mechanical thunder that went through the airframe and through her bones and through everything. 30 millimeter rounds at 4,000 feet per second, not a burst. A precisely timed, precisely aimed, precisely calculated series of impacts on a position that had been making itself useful against 540 people on the valley floor. The gun position on the eastern spur went quiet. She was already repositioning. Shallow climb bank turned to the south bleeding altitude on the far side of the ridgeline, where she was briefly invisible. She was updating her calculations. The barrel was hotter now. She adjusted the correction factor. On the net, someone said, "What the hell was that?" Someone else said, "Do we have air support? We have nobody cleared for air support." A third voice said, "I don't know. Something just hit the eastern spur." She lined up the second pass before anyone had finished processing the first one. The RPG team in the southern draw had repositioned. She had anticipated this. Prepared forces in prepared positions do not simply absorb an unexpected attack from an unexpected direction and wait to be addressed. They move. They adapt. She had noted the logical repositioning points when she was tracing the contour lines in the dark, had marked 3 of them as secondary positions in the kneeboard. She found them in the second position, which was where she would have been if she were them. She corrected for the changed barrel temperature and the shifted wind and the slightly different approach angle. The second pass was cleaner than the first. Down on the valley floor, something was changing. The low, urgent scramble of people trying not to be shot was beginning in some sectors to resolve into the more purposeful movement of people who believed they might survive. She banked for the third pass. In the command center at Fort Creston, the drone feed was showing things that had not been there 2 minutes before. The eastern spur gun position inactive. The southern draw disrupted secondary position no longer visible. And crossing the far edge of the northern ridgeline, banking into a repositioning arc so tight, it was almost arrogant, the unmistakable profile of an A-10 Thunderbolt II. Colonel Voss stood very still in front of the main display. He was watching the aircraft. He was watching the valley floor where the Marine formation, which had been compressing, running out of options and time, was beginning to develop the kind of coherence that comes when the pressure on one side of an equation is suddenly reduced. Major Clifton said, "Who authorized that aircraft?" No one answered. The radio net brought Price's voice clear as sound. "We have air support. Unknown air support. Something is working the ridgelines. East spur is quiet. Repeat, east spur is quiet." Then Commander Brent Calloway's voice. Different in texture from everything else on the net, the voice of a man who has been in more difficult situations than this one and has come out of all of them. No anxiety in it, only attention. "Who's covering us? Call sign identify." The communications technician at the secondary console typed quickly and stared at his screen. He said it quietly. The way you say something when you are not sure you are reading it correctly. "Viper 206. The room heard it. Voss heard it. He stood in front of the display and looked at the profile of the Warthog, crossing the northern ridgeline for its repositioning arc. He was running in the private space behind his eyes a very fast and very unwelcome calculation. The eastern spur, the southern draw, the angles, the precision, the fact that the aircraft was operating outside standard parameters in a way that was working, in a way that was legible to anyone who understood what they were looking at. He understood exactly what he was looking at. On the drone feed, the Warthog banked again. Steady, controlled, already setting up for the next pass with the unhurried precision of a pilot who knows where the targets are because she mapped them herself in the dark in a kneeboard that no one had bothered to read. Calloway's voice came back on the net. Flat, certain. "Viper 206, that's Mercer." A pause, brief. The pause of a man placing a memory that arrives from an unexpected direction. "I served with her father, Ramadi 2005. Earl Mercer. Best situational awareness I ever saw on the ground. He could read a ridgeline like other men read a clock." He paused again. "Now I know where she got it." The net went quiet for 3 seconds. Then from somewhere on the valley floor, from a man whose voice was still carrying the residue of the last 2 hours, but was rebuilding itself into something functional, "Let her work. Whatever she's doing, let her work." In the command center, no one gave an order. No one needed to. On the drone feed, the Warthog crossed the ridgeline again and disappeared briefly into the shadow of the terrain, and then came back out on the other side low and steady, and working through the geometry of the valley with the patient thoroughness of someone who has been preparing for this for a very long time. Voss watched it. He kept watching it. And somewhere underneath the protocol and the procedure and the wall he had built from a decision that had gone wrong 5 years ago, something was moving that he would not be able to stop because it was the truth. And the truth was on the drone feed. And the drone feed did not care what he had decided about himself in 2019. Outside over the Ironhold Basin under a Nevada sky burning with late summer clarity, Captain Sarah Mercer flew her fourth pass. Her hands were steady. Her father's dog tag caught the light from the instrument panel. The kneeboard was open on her thigh. She had more work to do. The valley changed the way a room changes when the loudest person in it finally stops talking. Not all at once, not cleanly. The way change actually happens in contested ground, in pieces, in sectors, with setbacks and pauses, and moments where it could still go either way. But the direction had shifted, and the people on the valley floor could feel it the way you feel a change in wind before you can name what has changed. The eastern spur was quiet. The southern draw had been disrupted twice. The second disruption had caught the RPG crew mid-repositioning, which meant they had not fired the round they were setting up. That calculation existed in the outcome rather than the intent. Sarah had been working the geometry. The geometry had consequences she was not fully tracking because she did not have the capacity to track them and also do the work. She was on her fifth pass. The barrel temperature was now something she was calculating from a model rather than a table, because the table had been built for the first three passes, and she was past that now into the territory where her own data collection from the previous passes was her best available reference. She adjusted and fired and assessed and adjusted again, the cycle running faster than thought, faster than language in the part of the brain that does not explain itself. The net was more coherent now, not calm, coherent. Voices were sequencing, positions were being reported. The squad that had consolidated near the stopped vehicle had moved to a more defensible position and was now providing covering fire toward the western ridgeline where a secondary element had been working its way down toward the road. She noted the western element. She calculated the approach. Commander Brent Calloway was on the net with the contained authority of a man who has done the most difficult version of his job long enough that the difficulty no longer shows on the outside. He was coordinating the ground elements with the same steady efficiency that she was applying in the air, and the effect of the two of them working in parallel, without direct communication, without coordination, each reading the same situation from different altitudes, was that the valley was beginning to develop openings where before there had been only walls. She heard him say to no one in particular, and everyone simultaneously, "She's cutting the threads. Let her work the pattern." He understood what she was doing. He could read it from the ground, the way she was reading the ground from the air, and the fact of being understood, not praised, not acknowledged formally, simply comprehended by someone who knew what they were looking at, settled something in her chest that she hadn't known was unsettled. She banked and set up the approach to the western element. The pass was longer, the angle shallower, because the western ridgeline had a different profile, and she had to account for the proximity of two friendly positions that had moved since her last assessment. She recalculated. She adjusted the release point. She flew the line she had calculated and not the line she had flown before, because the situation was not the same situation it had been 6 minutes ago. The western element scattered, not eliminated. Scattered. For the purposes of the next 12 minutes, scattered was sufficient. On the net corridors forming, east to the LZ corridors forming. The landing zone was a flat section of valley floor, approximately 800 meters from the main vehicle concentration. It had not been the primary extraction point in the original operation plan because the original operation plan had not included an extraction. Sarah had identified it on her third pass when she was building the spatial model that told her where the helicopters would need to go and what would need to happen to the terrain between here and there to make the approach survivable. She made the calculation without being asked, without communicating it. She filed it in the working memory of the flight and held it there and continued doing what needed to be done in the sequence it needed to be done, which was one of the things the kneeboard had prepared her for without ever stating it explicitly, that the preparation you do is never just for the problem you imagine. It is for the architecture of thinking clearly under conditions that will not match your imagination. She called Calloway on a secondary frequency. 1 transmission, 4 pieces of information. The LZ coordinates the recommended approach, heading for the helicopters, the 2 remaining active threat positions she had not yet fully addressed, and her estimated fuel state. He acknowledged in 2 words. She was back on the primary frequency before anyone else had registered that the exchange had happened. The helicopters were already airborne. They had been scrambled from the forward staging base 14 minutes after the initial contact report, holding at a safe distance, waiting for the corridor that doctrine said needed to exist before rotary wing aircraft entered a contested valley. The corridor now existed. Sarah had made it. She was on her seventh pass when the first helicopter crossed the northern ridgeline and began its descent toward the LZ. She did not watch it. She was working the last active threat position on the eastern edge of the valley, a secondary gun position that had been quiet during the main engagement but had shown renewed activity. She addressed it in two passes. Careful, economical. When she came around on the orbit that brought the LZ into her sightline, the first helicopter was on the ground and figures were moving toward it. She held the orbit and watched the approaches. She watched for threat signatures, for anything moving on the ridgelines, for anything repositioning toward the LZ, for the small indicators of intent that show up in the thermal data before they show up anywhere else. Nothing moved. The first helicopter lifted. The second was already descending. Owen Price had been in the valley for 5 hours and 43 minutes when he got to the LZ. He was 20 meters behind the squad leader, who was moving at a controlled pace that communicated both urgency and discipline, and the discipline was the part keeping Price's legs working because his legs had stopped being something he could fully account for some time ago. They were doing what he needed them to do. He was trying not to ask them too many questions about it. He was thinking as he moved about a conversation he had never gotten to finish. His mother had called 2 nights before the operation. He had been busy gear check, pre-mission prep, and he had kept it short. He had said he would call when they got back. He had meant it the way you mean things you expect to be straightforward. He was thinking about that call, about how he would have more to say to her now, about how the things you need to say to people expand in direct proportion to the possibility that you might not get to say them. He had been on the radio for most of the engagement. That had been his job. Maintain communications relay positions, keep the net as clean as he could. He had done this. He was not sure how well because his internal assessment of his own performance had become unreliable around the second hour when the vehicle 30 meters to his left had caught fire and the crew had gotten out and he had helped one of them to cover. And that was not something the training had fully reached. But he had stayed on the net. He had kept reporting. He had heard the Warthog before he saw it. The low mechanical thunder of the GAU-8, a sound that occupied its own category entirely, whose meaning this is happening on purpose. This is aimed, this is on our side, had taken him approximately 3 seconds to process. Those 3 seconds had been the longest of the afternoon. Then the eastern spur gun position had gone quiet. He had looked up at the ridgeline, which you were not supposed to do, and he had seen the aircraft crossing the northern ridge in its repositioning arc low and fast, and absolutely certain of where it was going. He had heard the comms traffic when Callaway identified the call sign. He had heard the name. It had not meant anything to him specifically. He was 19 years old. The pilot community was not a world he moved through with any fluency. What he had known watching that aircraft cross the ridgeline was that someone had come. Not because they were ordered to, not on a scheduled rotation. Someone had looked at the situation from somewhere else and done the calculation and decided that the calculation required them to be in the air, and they were in the air, and they were doing something precise and deliberate to the positions that had been making the valley floor uninhabitable. Someone had come. He made it to the helicopter on his own feet. He was aware of this specifically the way you are aware of the things you were not sure you would be able to do. He got on. He found a position. He looked back at the valley as the aircraft lifted. The Warthog was still there, still orbiting, still working. He watched it until the ridgeline came up between him and the valley, and there was nothing left to see. He thought about the phone call he was going to make when he landed. The last helicopter lifted at 1741. Sarah watched it clear the ridgeline. She tracked it until it was outside any threat radius she could calculate from the remaining positions, which by that point were minimal and disorganized. Then she did a final orbit of the valley. Full circuit, looking at everything. The burning vehicles were still burning. The road was empty. The ridgelines were still. The gun position on the eastern spur was permanently quiet. She cataloged what she saw, filed it in the part of her memory that would go into the debrief, into the kneeboard entries she would make when she was back on the ground, into the record that would exist whether or not anyone read it. Then she pointed the Warthog north and went home. She heard the net traffic on the way back. Callaway on the primary frequency, his voice carrying the weight of a man making a statement he knew would matter. All 540 accounted for. Say again, all 540 accounted for. Every name answered. Not one left in that valley. She heard it, and she was alone in the cockpit over the Nevada desert, with the sun going low and orange off the canopy, and her father's dog tag on the instrument panel, and something that had been held very tightly inside her chest for a very long time, released slightly like a knot that has been soaked long enough to move. Not all the way, just enough to breathe through. She reached up and picked up the dog tag. She held it in her left hand while her right hand stayed on the stick. The metal was warm. She held it the way you hold something you are not sure you will get to hold again, carefully with full attention. She put it back around her neck and kept flying. The flight line at Fort Creston was not supposed to be a place where things happened publicly. It was a working space. Concrete and heat and the smell of hydraulic fluid and exhaust. People moved through it on purpose, doing specific things. When Sarah Mercer taxied Viper 206 back onto the apron, the flight line was not behaving like itself. She saw them as she came around the final turn, and she processed the image in the seconds before she stopped the aircraft. Marines, not a casual gathering. A line, formed on both sides of the path from the aircraft to the operations building, extending the full length of it. Some in full kit, some without helmets. Some in the disheveled state of men who had been through a hard afternoon and had come straight here before changing anything about themselves. She focused on shutting down the aircraft the correct way, in the correct sequence, because the shutdown sequence was what you did when you got back, and it needed to be done correctly, regardless of what was waiting outside the canopy. Right engine, left engine, avionics, weapons systems safe. She picked up the dog tag from the instrument panel and put it back on. She picked up the kneeboard from her thigh and clipped it to her vest. She opened the canopy. The Nevada air came in hot, dry reel, and with it came the sound of the flight line, which was the sound of a great many people not making noise. She climbed down. The silence held while she walked. She kept her eyes on the operations building and at the end of the line. She kept her pace even. She held the flight helmet under her left arm. At the end of the line, two men were waiting. Colonel Raymond Voss stood with the posture of a man who has been standing at attention for a long time and will continue to do so because the alternative in this moment is not something he has identified. His jaw was set. His hands were at his sides. He looked like a man who had prepared a speech and was no longer sure any of it was right. Beside him, slightly to the right, was Commander Brent Calloway. He was still in field kit. There was dust in the creases of his uniform and around his eyes and, in the lines of his neck, the layered dust of a man who had been in a valley for most of an afternoon. He looked like what he was, a man who had come from somewhere serious and had not yet cleaned it off, because the thing he needed to do before he cleaned it off was this. Sarah stopped. Voss said you disobeyed direct orders. His voice was controlled. The voice he used for official statements. The voice trained over 31 years to deliver difficult things in the format that difficult things required. She said, "Yes, sir." The word dropped between them and sat there. Voss was quiet for long enough that the silence became the sound of a man revising himself in real time, which is one of the most difficult things a person can do and does not have a sound as well, but has a quality. The people watching can feel, even if they cannot name it. He said, "You saved a battalion." 3 words, not a speech, not a ceremony. 3 words delivered in a voice that had dropped the institutional register entirely and was operating in something lower and more fundamental, the voice people use when they are saying what is actually true. She said, "Yes, sir." Voss looked at her, not at her name tape, which was where he had been looking for 11 months, at her, at the specific person in front of him who had spent 11 months doing the work in the dark and had gone up today and done the thing and had come back and was standing here without any demand that he acknowledge what it meant. He did not say what he wanted to say. He did not know yet what he wanted to say. He was not a man who spoke before he was ready, which had been one of his strengths, and in this case had been something else entirely. Calloway stepped forward. He raised his hand in a salute. Not quickly, not procedurally. The way you salute when you mean it to be a record, when you want the gesture to be unmistakable, when you are using the vocabulary of the institution to say something the institution does not have words for. He held it. He said, "I served with your father in Ramadi, Captain, 2005 and 2006. He was the best man to have beside you when the terrain went wrong. He could read ground that the maps got wrong every time. He never missed what mattered." He paused. He said, "Now I've seen it twice." He dropped the salute. Sarah Mercer stood in the Nevada heat with the flight line full of people who had laughed at her and dismissed her and moved to other tables and said things in corridors they hadn't bothered to lower their voices for, and she looked at Calloway, and something in her face moved. Not collapsed. Moved. The controlled expression she had worn at the chow hall table alone, and at the back of the briefing room, and at the flight line with the kneeboard and the flashlight, that expression loosened just enough to show what it had been holding. She did not cry loudly. She did not perform grief or relief or vindication. 2 tears, that was all. One from each eye, quiet as everything else about her, and then she blinked, and she was herself again, steady and exact. She said he never wasted a shot either, sir. Calloway made a sound, short and genuine. It broke the surface of the moment in a way that nothing prepared could have. Behind him along the line something moved. A sound began. Not cheering, it had the quality of recognition rather than celebration. The sound of people acknowledging something that deserved to be acknowledged with the weight and restraint of people who understood what they were acknowledging. Boots on concrete, hands together. Not wild, deep. Sarah Mercer did not smile or raise her hand or turn to accept it. She looked at the operations building at the end of the line, and then she looked back at Voss and she said, "I need to complete my debrief and log the flight, sir." Voss nodded once. She walked through it. The investigation began 4 days later. This was expected. You did not take an aircraft that was not authorized for combat operations and fly it into an active engagement without an investigation. The investigation was correct, and Sarah had anticipated it with the same thoroughness she applied to everything else. She had spent the evening after the flight completing her entries. The kneeboard was full now, the last pages covered in the documentation of everything she had done in the air over Ironhold Basin, each pass, each target, each calculation, each correction, the fuel state at each phase, the pylon fault, and the manual compensation values she had used. The record of what had happened was complete and accurate, and in her handwriting on paper she had filled during months of evenings that no one had watched. On the second day of the investigation, Captain Delaney submitted his formal statement. He had been sitting on the information for 72 hours measuring what it would cost him to say it against what it had already cost 540 men for someone else not to say something when it mattered. He said it. The statement confirmed that the convoy route had been communicated through the same compromised source channel Sarah had flagged in August of 2023. A secondary inquiry was opened. It ran parallel to the primary investigation, and its conclusions were classified, but the effect was visible in several personnel transfers over the following month, and in a revised protocol for source validation that appeared in operational guidelines before the year was out. The source had been burned. The valley had been a kill box. Sarah had written both of those things in a small green kneeboard on a base in Nevada, and no one had read it until it was too late to matter in the way it should have mattered, and early enough that it still mattered in the way that made the difference. During those 3 weeks, the base operated with the subdued atmosphere of a place where something large has happened and has not yet been fully processed. Officers who had laughed in the briefing room were civil in the stiff way of men performing civility, because the alternative requires a confrontation with themselves they are not yet ready to have. On the 9th day, Holt found her at the flight line. He did not approach the way he had always moved in her presence before, with the loose, expansive confidence of a man who has never had to calculate the cost of occupying space. He came up alongside her while she was completing a post-maintenance check and stood there for a moment without speaking, which was itself a new thing. She continued working. She did not stop or look at him or acknowledge him in any way that would require him to have already said what he had come to say. He said, "I was wrong about you." She made a notation in the kneeboard. She turned to the next item on the maintenance checklist. He said, "I don't expect that to fix anything. I just wanted to say it directly." She looked at him then, not with warmth and not with coldness, with the same level of attention she gave to everything that required honest assessment. She said, "I know." She went back to the checklist. He stood there another moment. Then he nodded once to no one in particular and walked away. He did not look back. She did not watch him go. There was no resolution in it that either of them would have called satisfying, but there was something true in it, and truth in those situations is usually the most you can ask for. When the investigating officer asked for documentation, Sarah handed over the kneeboard. Not a copy, not a summary, the original. The whole of it, from the first pages of Canon harmonics written 11 months ago to the final flight log entries written 4 days after the engagement. 143 pages of small, neat handwriting, corrections and annotations, cross-references, tables built up over time, revised, refined, expanded as she learned more and thought more carefully. On page 12, dated June 14, 2023, the document reference number for the CAS assignment list, and below it, her note. Confirm, preserve. Wait. On page 31, dated the night before the Ironhold briefing, the source identifier for the intelligence assessment and her note. If burned, kill box. On page 37, the date of the briefing itself. Her topographic analysis of the valley, the approach angles, the fire coverage calculations. The notation at the bottom, raised in briefing, not incorporated. On page 109 from the day of the engagement, the pylon fault identifier, the manual compensation tables, she had applied the updated values from each pass. The investigating officer read through it for a long time. He looked up and said, "How long did it take you to build this?" She said 11 months, more or less. He said, "Did anyone know you were maintaining this?" She said, "No, sir." He said, "Why not?" She said, "Because it would have been taken as a provocation, and because it was useful to me regardless of whether anyone knew about it, and because I expected to use it eventually." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You expected to use it." She said, "I expected the situation to eventually require what was in it." He closed the kneeboard and set it on the table between them. He said, "I'm going to need to retain this as a primary document." She said, "I know. I made a full copy before I handed it in." Voss submitted to 4 interview sessions with the investigating officer. He answered every question directly. He did not use institutional language to create distance between himself and what he had done, which included removing her from the CAS list, dismissing her terrain analysis, and enforcing a protocol in a situation where the protocol was contributing to the deaths of the people it was ostensibly protecting. He had reasons for all of it. He gave the reasons. He did not offer them as justifications. In the 4th session, the investigating officer asked what he would do differently. Voss said, "I would read the kneeboard." He meant it as more than a reference to the document. He meant it as a statement about the kind of attention he had withheld and from whom and how long and at what cost. Mouse. The investigating officer wrote it down. It appeared without attribution in the final report's summary of findings in a section titled Preparation and Institutional Listening. It was the most quoted line when the report circulated through the training commands. The investigation concluded with a formal reprimand on Voss's record and a commendation for Sarah Mercer, citing exceptional judgment under pressure, comprehensive pre-mission preparation, and combat effectiveness under non-standard conditions. It also included a recommendation attached as an appendix that the protocol governing close air support minimum distance requirements be reviewed in the context of terrain differential scenarios, the exact argument Sarah had made in the command center while 540 people were running out of time. The recommendation had been drafted by the investigating officer. The language was almost identical to what she had written in the kneeboard on page 37. The ceremony was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Dress uniforms, a citation read aloud, a medal, the institutional acknowledgement that the institution was capable of making delivered in the institutional format. Sarah submitted her response 3 days before. It was a single page, clear, concise in the precise language she used for all official documents. She was grateful for the recognition. She declined the public ceremony. In its place, she submitted a proposal. She wanted to build a training program, not a revision of the existing CAS training program, a parallel track available as an elective to pilots in their first 2 years at the base focused on the skills that official training characterized as supplementary. Manual ballistic calculation without avionics support. Terrain analysis from topographic data without digital overlay. Fuel management under degraded instrument conditions. The things that become necessary when the systems designed to prevent necessity fail. The program had a single completion requirement. Each participant would maintain a kneeboard throughout. Not a digital record, not a report in standard format. A physical kneeboard in their own hand containing whatever they had learned and observed and calculated and thought about during the training. It would be submitted at the end, but not graded by any rubric. It would be read. That was the only requirement. It would be read by an instructor who was paying attention. She included a detailed curriculum outline. It was comprehensive. It covered a range of scenarios the official training addressed partially or not at all. It was built from 11 months of work done in the dark when no one was watching by someone who was preparing for the thing no one thought would happen. The proposal went to Voss for signature. He read it the same evening he received it. He read all of it, including the curriculum outline, which took 40 minutes. He put it down on his desk and looked out the window at the flight line, lit in the flat way of evening security lighting, concrete and shadow, and the dark shapes of aircraft at rest. He thought about a great many things. Then he picked up a pen and signed the proposal in the place indicated and forwarded it to the appropriate office and went home. The letter arrived in Red Cliff, Arizona on a Tuesday in October. It was addressed to Gloria Mercer, who had been Earl's sister and who had finished raising Sarah after Earl died. She was 63 years old and lived in the same house on the flat edge of town where the dust came in off the desert in the afternoon and the evenings went amber and quiet. She read it at the kitchen table. The letter was from the Department of the Army, formal and correct in its language, notifying her that Captain Sarah Mercer had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions on a date in Nevada. The citation was available upon request. The recipient had been offered and declined a public ceremony. Gloria Mercer read the letter twice. Then she folded it precisely in thirds and held it in both hands for a moment. She got up and went to the shelf above the kitchen sink where she kept things that mattered, and she set the letter there next to a photograph of Earl at his medical discharge in 2009, standing with his hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah, 14 years old and already almost as tall as his chin, both of them squinting into the same Arizona sun. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she went outside and sat on the porch where the evening light was coming down across the fields in long, horizontal gold, and she sat with it and she let it be what it was. In the spring of the following year, the first cohort of pilots enrolled in the elective training program that had no official name but was referred to on the base and eventually elsewhere simply as the kneeboard program. There were 14 of them, 11 men and 3 women, ages ranging from 23 to 31. Different aircraft types, different backgrounds, different levels of what the official record would call experience. Sarah ran the first session herself. She stood at the front of a smaller room off the main corridor with windows that let in the morning light and a whiteboard that carried the ghost of old diagrams no matter how thoroughly it had been cleaned. She was 28 years old. She had been at Fort Creston for almost 2 years. In that time, she had been the woman no one wanted at the briefing table, the pilot no one wanted in the rotation, the voice in the back row that a colonel had dismissed with a sentence in front of 40 people. She did not think about any of that standing at the front of this room. She thought about what needed to be done. She had a stack of small kneeboard notebooks on the table, green covers, the same kind she had been issued and never replaced. She handed one to each of them. She said, "This is yours. Put your name on the front. You will fill it the way you fill it. There are no required formats and no standardized entries. What I ask is this: when you learn something, when you observe something, when you calculate something you want to remember, write it down. Write it in a way that makes sense to you. Not to me, not to a review board. To you 6 months from now, when the conditions are different and you need what you know." She looked at the room, 14 faces paying attention. She said the systems will fail. Not all of them and not all at once, but some of them at some point will not perform the function they were built to perform. When that happens, what you have is what you know. What you know is what you built. You build it here. She tapped the kneeboard in her hand. She said you build it the way everything that matters gets built, in the time no one gives you for it, in the conditions that aren't arranged to make it easy, in the dark if necessary because it matters to you and not because anyone is watching. She paused. She looked at the room again. The young faces, the fresh uniforms, the particular expression of people who have not yet learned which parts of their training will matter and which will not, who are still carrying all of it with equal weight. She thought about herself 11 months earlier, alone on a tarp at the edge of the flight line with a red lens flashlight. She thought about the evenings that had looked from the outside like nothing at all. She said what you put in here will look like nothing to most people. It will look like notes. It will look like homework. It will look like the kind of thing that a person does when they haven't found anything better to do with their time. Let it look like that. The value of it is not in how it looks. The value of it is in what it does at the moment it's needed when everything else has failed. She set the kneeboard down on the table. She said, "Let's start." The Ironhold Basin engagement was eventually included in a case study used at 2 Army training commands cited for the example it provided of non-standard close air support employment in terrain differential scenarios. The case study identified it as an illustration of effective autonomous decision-making under communications breakdown. It did not name the pilot. The pilots who went through the kneeboard program knew her name. The Marines who had been in the valley knew her name. Owen Price, who made his phone call to his mother the evening he returned from Ironhold, said only that things had been bad and then they hadn't and that someone had come. He did not name her. He would not know for several more months that the voice in the briefing room that had tried to warn them about the valley and the hands on the controls that had gotten them out of it belonged to the same person. When he found out, he wrote her a letter. He was not a man who wrote letters naturally. He wrote this one because some things require being put down in writing, because some debts cannot be settled any other way. Calloway knew her name, and when people asked him, as they sometimes did in the sideways way, people in that world asked questions that mattered to them about the finest gunwork he had ever witnessed from the ground, he would think for a moment genuinely the way a man thinks about something that has stayed with him. Then he would say, "I've seen it twice. The second time was better. When the kneeboard program entered its third year, 22 training commands across 4 service branches had requested the curriculum. The request came not through formal channels initially, but through the informal network of people who had heard the story and had thought carefully about what it meant, not as a story about one exceptional pilot in one exceptional situation, but as a story about what an institution fails to notice until it almost loses everything because of the failing. The curriculum outline was attached to each request. It was comprehensive. It covered scenarios the official training addressed partially or not at all. It was built from 11 months of work done in the dark on a base in Nevada by a woman no one had been watching. Voss read every iteration of the curriculum. He read it the way he had read the original proposal, all of it carefully with the attention he had not extended 11 months before when it would have mattered most. He did not know if this was penitence or professionalism. He decided eventually that the distinction did not matter. What mattered was the reading. On the last page of the kneeboard that had become a document, the one now in a case file where it would remain, Sarah had written something after the final flight entry. Not a calculation, not a reference number. 4 lines in the same small, neat handwriting as everything else. The systems will fail. The preparation will not. Do the work. Let the shot surprise you. It was not addressed to anyone. It was not signed. It was simply there in the place where the numbers ended, written by a woman who had built her doctrine in the dark and flown it into the light, who had carried her father's words across a decade of mornings and evenings and long nights on a base where she was managed and tolerated and worked around and dismissed, who had known what the valley was before anyone else would listen, who had gone anyway when no one else would go. There are men who were in that valley who still think about it, sometimes late at night or early in the morning, when the mind goes to the places it keeps returning to without being asked. They think about the hours when the exits were closing and the radios were fraying and the math of survival was running in the wrong direction. They think about what changed and how fast it changed and what it sounded like, the low mechanical thunder of a cannon that should not have been there. That was there anyway because one person had done the work that no one saw for 11 months without recognition or reward or any assurance that it would ever matter. Some of them have families now, sons and daughters, who will never know that the specific afternoon their fathers came home from was the afternoon it could have gone differently. The afternoon that turned on preparation nobody assigned. Work that lived in a green kneeboard. A woman who sat alone at a flight line table in the Nevada heat and wrote down what she knew because she was the kind of person who wrote down what she knew. Because her father had taught her that accuracy was not a sometimes thing. Because she was going to be ready when the moment came, even if the moment never came and no one ever knew she had been ready. The moment came. She was ready. Who had come home? And 540 men had come home with her. 0 left behind.